Let us step back in time to a crisp February morning in 1931 in the town of Lorain, Ohio. The air carries the faint tang of Lake Erie and the low thrum of a steel mill drifting over rooftops. On a street of modest wooden houses, a baby girl draws her first breath. Her parents name her Chloe Ardelia Wofford. The world outside is still wrestling with the weight of the Great Depression, but inside this small home, there is warmth, story, and song. The morning light slants through lace curtains and falls across the linoleum floor in honey-colored rectangles. A kerosene lamp waits on the kitchen table, its chimney freshly cleaned. This is a household where the sound of a mother's humming and the scratch of a father's razor against a leather strop make the rhythm of the day. Every ordinary object here will one day shimmer in her writing. The neighborhood is a patchwork of hardworking families who left the Jim Crow South for something better. Chloe's mother, Rama, brought with her a fierce pride and a way of singing the blues while she chopped vegetables. Her father, George, was a welder who loved books and taught his children that no one could ever make them feel inferior without their consent. Even the family's rented house, with its creaking porch and the grapevine curling around the back fence, seemed to breathe dignity. Little Chloe learned to read by the age of 3, tracing the shapes of letters in the lamplight as her grandmother told stories of enslaved ancestors who found a way to fly. In the early evening, the streets smelled of frying cornmeal and damp earth. Children played double dutch on the sidewalk, their shadows stretching long and thin in the golden hour. She grew up surrounded by the low, steady music of ordinary life. The whistle of a freight train, the clink of milk bottles on the step before sunrise, the murmur of adults on a front porch after sundown, these sounds settled deep into her ear. In the Morrison household, news was not simply received, it was turned over and examined like a smooth stone. Her grandfather played the violin, and her mother sang in the church choir, so Chloe understood early that a voice could carry both sorrow and exultation. On Sunday mornings, the sanctuary filled with a quiet rustle of starched dresses and the slow, honeyed light filtering through stained glass. The wooden pews creaked, and the minister's cadence rose and fell like lake waves. Young Chloe absorbed the sermons not as lectures, but as a kind of poetry, a music older than the town itself. She would slip away to read on the back steps. With a library book in her lap, she traveled far beyond Lorain. Jane Austen, Leo Tolstoy, and Fyodor Dostoevsky sat beside her while the neighbor's cat dozed in a patch of sun. Yet she noticed something troubling in those pages. The characters who looked like her were absent or drawn in clumsy strokes. Even as a girl, she began to wonder what it would be like to write a book that placed Black girls at the center of the universe, a book where their inner lives were the sky and the soil. This thought did not burn like a fire. It glowed like a pilot light, steady and patient, tucked beneath the everyday demands of schoolwork and chores. She attended an integrated high school, a place of worn wooden staircases and chalk dust that floated in the slanting afternoon light. Academically brilliant, she moved through her classes with a quiet confidence. The teachers recognized her gift for language, the way she could turn an ordinary sentence into something that hung in the air like the scent of rain coming. In the evenings, she worked at a local library, reshelving volumes and listening to the collective breathing of readers lost in their chairs. The library was a sanctuary of hushed voices and soft footfalls, the slight squeak of a cartwheel, the dusty sweetness of aging paper. The tall windows overlooked a street where maples turned gold in autumn. She felt then that books were living things, tethered to the world by the hands of the people who loved them. After high school, she traveled south to Howard University, leaving the familiar lake winds for the brick walkways and sycamore trees of Washington, D.C. The change was a gentle unfolding. On the train, she watched the landscape shift from factory towns to sloping tobacco fields. At Howard, she changed her name to Toni, a simple shortening that felt like slipping into a second skin. She studied literature in sun-drenched classrooms with high ceilings and ceiling fans that ticked like slow clocks. The campus air smelled of boxwood hedges and wet stone after a thunderstorm. She joined a theater troupe, found a circle of friends who debated poetry late into the night on the steps of Founders Library, and let the rich intellectual life of a historically black university shape the angles of her mind. The girl from Lorain was becoming a woman who would one day carry entire communities inside her. After earning her master's degree at Cornell, she returned to teaching and, eventually, to a small house in Washington. She married, had 2 sons, and lived the full, taxing rhythm of early motherhood. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the boys were still asleep and the world outside was a deep indigo, she began to write. She turned the kitchen table into a desk, pulling a notebook close and letting the lamplight pool around her hands. She wrote about a little black girl who wanted blue eyes, a wish that was never really about color, but about being seen. The sentences came slowly, like water finding its path through sand. She knew she was building something new, a novel that would hold the beauty and pain of her people without flinching, yet would never raise its voice. It would speak in the soft, urgent tones of a lullaby you cannot forget. The novel she wrote in those early morning hours would become The Bluest Eye. It settled into the world in 1970 like a quiet stone dropped into still water. The story is set in Lorain, her own childhood town, in the autumn of 1941. Marigold seeds fail to bloom that year, and with that simple image, the entire book opens like a flower turning toward a slant of late light. The narrator, a young girl named Claudia, looks back on the life of Pecola Breedlove with a tenderness that feels almost like prayer. Through Toni's pen, we see the bare wooden floors and the linoleum kitchens of the neighborhood. We hear the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant cry of a train. The prose moves in a rhythm that matches the rocking of a chair on a front porch, slow and meditative. Pecola's world is drawn with a gentle precision that makes every object luminous. There's the cracked, sun-faded doll in the corner, the chipped enamel cup on the windowsill, the curtain that lifts with every sigh of wind. Morrison describes the season with the patience of someone watching light change on a wall. Quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. The sentence is a doorway. Stepping through it, you can feel the dry grass of vacant lots, the cool air that smells of coal smoke and chrysanthemums. The neighborhood children play in the streets until dusk, their laughter echoing off the brick facades. Streetlights flicker on one by one, spilling amber pools on the pavement. The town is a character itself, with its quiet alleys and its houses that lean just a little toward one another, as if sharing secrets. We visit the Breedlove storefront home, a space that used to be a shop and still carries the ghost of commerce in its wide front windows. Through those windows, the autumn sun comes flat and pale, illuminating a meager neatness. An ironing board stands in the corner, a basket of clean laundry waiting. The radio plays soft big band tunes, the sound crackling just slightly, a comforting imperfection. Morrison does not flinch from the family's hardships, but she also never denies them their ordinary beauties, the smell of starch on a blouse, the small pleasure of a carefully mended hem, the way the winter light makes a mosaic on the floor. Her narration encircles pain with the understanding that, even in the ugliest circumstances, people reach for the grace of a clean kitchen, a combed head of hair, a quiet moment by the fire escape. Nature serves as a quiet witness throughout the novel. The earth itself seems to grieve the marigold's refusal to sprout. There is a kind of gentle animism in Morrison's prose, a belief that trees and soil and weather hold memory. At the town's edges, fields of goldenrod and wild aster nod in the breeze. By the lake, the water laps with a sound like sleepy breathing. The sky arches overhead, a pale, endless blue that feels almost maternal. Morrison places her characters within this landscape not as intruders, but as part of the same slow breathing system. When Pecola walks home past the gardens, the fading zinnias and the drooping bean poles seem to bend toward her in sympathy. The world of the novel is not cruel or punishing, it simply is, vast and indifferent, yet filled with small kindnesses for those who know how to look. The rhythm of school days provides a steady cadence. Chalkboards hold the dust of morning lessons. Penny loafers shuffle on wooden floors. A child's lunch is unwrapped from wax paper and eaten beneath an elm tree. Claudia and her sister Frida move through these days with a sharp, unsentimental love for one another. Their home, though marked by scarcity, is rich in ritual. The careful portioning of milk, the evening bath poured from a heated kettle, the safety of their mother's singing. In one unforgettable passage, Claudia recalls sinking into the warmth of the quilts on a cold night, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. The entire house breathes around her, its joists settling with soft ticks and sighs. This is the deep comfort of ordinary life, the foundation from which all of Morrison's later work will spring. The novel also offers a deep meditation on seeing and being seen. Pecola believes that if she only had blue eyes, the world would finally look at her with tenderness. Morrison handles this longing with the gentlest touch, never mocking. In the quiet hours of the novel, we find Pecola standing before a mirror, the dim light of a single bulb casting her face in soft obscurity. The glass reflects not a defect, but a human soul yearning for transformation, a feeling familiar to anyone who has ever stared into their own eyes and wished for something just out of reach. Morrison's sentences hold that wish like a butterfly in cupped hands, careful not to crush it. The book closes not with a declaration, but with a whispered line about the earth itself, about marigolds, about the silence that rolls over a town after a long, hard season. It is an ending that feels like dusk settling over your own eyelids. In the years after its publication, the Bluest did not shout for attention. It slowly found its readers, passed from hand to hand like a beloved, worn volume. Morrison continued her day job as an editor, working in a high-rise in New York City where the windows offered a view of the Hudson River glittering in the afternoon. The hum of elevators and the soft clack of typewriters were the backdrop to her life. But in her mind, a new story was already unfurling, a story about a place called the Bottom, and two girls whose friendship would reshape the land itself. The light in her office was gray and fluorescent, but inside her imagination, the sun was golden and wide over a hilltop community. She was learning that a writer could be many things at once, a mother, an editor, a commuter on a train, and also the keeper of a whole world waiting to be born. Sula arrived in 1973, carrying the scent of Ohio earth and the sound of humming women in the hills of Medallion. Morrison gave her readers the Bottom, a black neighborhood perched on the slopes above a valley town. The Bottom was a place of sun-baked grass and slanting porches, where the sky seemed larger than anywhere else. The novel opens with the quiet destruction of that community long after the story's end, a gentle note of loss that only deepens the world to come. The weather of the Bottom was a character in its own right, heavy summer afternoons that pressed down like a warm hand, autumn evenings crisp with the smell of burning leaves, and winters so still you could hear the snowflakes touching the ground. The houses, some painted a fading green, some bare with silvered by the sun, clustered together like elders at a church supper. At the heart of this novel stands the friendship between two girls, Sula Peace and Nell Wright. They meet in childhood, and their bond becomes the scaffolding of the entire landscape. They roam the hillsides barefoot, the earth cool and damp under their soles. They dig for night crawlers in the soft soil behind the garden. The river, unnamed but always present, curves through the valley with a low, dreamy murmur. On long summer days, the girls lie on their backs in the tall grass, watching clouds shift shapes, and in those moments, Morrison allows the reader to feel the fullness of a black girl's interior universe, the wonder, the fear, the wild, private joy. No writer before her had lavished such quiet, painterly attention on the inner lives of young black women, and the effect was like opening a window onto a world you always sensed but had never seen. The houses of the Bottom were alive with the small machinery of daily survival. At Nell's home, the kitchen smelled of baking soda and lemon oil. Her mother Helene kept a spotless house where every doily was starched. Through the spotless kitchen window, you could see the neat rows of tomatoes and collard greens stretching toward the back fence. At Sula's home, a rambling structure with a warren of rooms, the atmosphere was looser, woven with the smoke of a pipe and the laughter of boarders. Morrison described the Peace House as a place where the floorboards carried the memory of 1,000 footsteps, where dust motes twirled in the shaft of afternoon light like tiny, slow dancers. These two interiors, one cool and orderly, one warm and chaotic, mirrored the girls' temperaments, and Morrison traced their differences with a naturalist's loving eye. The community of the bottom functioned like a collective organism. On any given afternoon, women shelled peas on the porch while the men mended nets by the shed. The clatter of a sewing machine filtered through an open window. The local church, a white clapboard building with a bell that rang out every Sunday, stood at the highest point of the road. Its pews were worn smooth by generations, and the sunlight through its one stained glass window cast a ruby and amber glow across the congregation. Morrison understood that a place was made not only of soil and weather, but also of the stories people told each other. She filled the bottom with gossip and ghost tales, with songs hummed while hanging laundry, with the slow, unwinding narratives of old men on the store porch. All of it hummed beneath the surface of the novel, a deep, communal breath. The novel also carried the weight of grief, always handled with the same quiet dignity that marked the turning of seasons. When tragedy touched Sula's family, Morrison did not linger on the horror. Instead, she widened the lens to show how a whole landscape holds sorrow. On the night that changed everything, the river was glassy and still, reflecting a full moon. Crickets sang in the rusted weeds along the bank. Afterward, the house was silent and filled with a soft, amber lamplight that seemed almost kind. Morrison never raises her voice in these passages. She lets the images do the work, a dress laid carefully on a bed, a pair of shoes resting toe to heel, a window left open to the cool night air. The grief becomes a presence, yes, but also a kind of deepening color in the fabric of the town, a reminder that every community carries its own unseen stories. Nature throughout Sula serves as a healing force, a steady, ancient presence that outlasts all human drama. The return of the robins each spring, the bloom of goldenrod along the railroad tracks, the slow falling of hickory nuts in the fall, these cycles went on regardless. Morrison describes the earth beneath the bottom as generous, yielding tomatoes and squash and unruly patches of wild blackberries. One passage lingers on the sensation of a cool, shaded creek bed where the water is so clear you can see the polished pebbles at the bottom. The girls dip their feet there, and the cold water numbs their ankles. It is a moment of pure, suspended grace, an image of peace that has no plot function, but simply exists to remind us that life, even in the midst of hardship, offers pockets of still water and dappled shade. The book closes not with a dramatic resolution, but with a long, tender look backward. Years later, after Sula has gone and the bottom itself has begun to fade into memory, Nell walks through the hills alone. The grass is high, the old houses are gone or going. The sky is a vast, soft lavender at dusk. And there, in the silence, Nell finally understands the shape of the love she carried all along. She does not cry out, she simply stands there, feeling the wind against her face. Morrison ends the novel on a note that feels like a low, sustained chord on an organ, something sorrowful and yet full of quiet hope. The reader is left standing in that twilight field, breathing the cool air, knowing that the bottom will always exist for those who remember it. In 1977, Morrison released Song of Solomon, a novel that feels like breathing mountain air after a long, deep sleep. The book opens with a man who thinks he can fly, leaping from a rooftop in a city very much like Detroit. But the story soon unfolds into a geographical and spiritual journey southward, from the icy pavements of Michigan to the red dirt roads of Virginia. The protagonist, Milkman Dead, carries a name that already announces his separation from the earth, from family, from his own heart. Over the course of the novel, he will slowly learn to listen to the wind in the pines, to the whisper of old women, to the songs that map the past. Morrison fills this book with so much landscape that you can almost feel the weather changing as you turn the pages. The prose is a slow, gathering river, moving toward a revelation that is less a splash than a sigh. The opening scene sets the tone with the soft daily rhythms of a northern city. Robert Smith, an insurance agent, announces his flight from the roof of Mercy Hospital, and the entire neighborhood gathers as if for a street picnic. Morrison paints this moment not with panic, but with a peculiar, dreamy stillness. Women in housecoats pause their sweeping, children look up from hopscotch, The lake wind off Superior Avenue carries the scent of bread and coal gas. The sky is a pale, wintry blue, the kind that seems to hold its breath. Amid this quiet commotion, a woman gives birth to Milkman on the sidewalk below. The image is strange and tender, a life beginning as something else appears to end, all under the watchful gaze of a flock of starlings darkening the sky like flung pepper. It is a scene of everyday magic, and Morrison narrates it in the low, steady voice of a woman telling a bedtime story she has told 100 times before. Milkman grows up in a large, cold house on Not Doctor Street, a place where the windows always seem to face away from the sun. His father, Macon dead, is a man made rigid by the pursuit of property, and his mother Ruth is a ghost in her own parlor, still clutching the faded memory of her father. Morrison describes the house as a kind of beautiful mausoleum, with heavy mahogany furniture and drapes of dark green velvet that swallow the light. A greenish gloom falls over the rooms even at midday. But Milkman's Aunt Pilot lives at the other end of the emotional world, in a rundown shack by a river, where the air smells of pine needles and boiling wine. Pilot's home has no electricity, only the warm, flickering safety of oil lamps. Her front yard is yellow pine and dirt. Her back porch view is the slow, brown river itself. Morrison uses these two homes as opposing landscapes of the heart, and between them, Milkman begins the slow, painful walk toward knowing himself. Pilot is the novel's true north, a woman who carries her own father's bones and a smooth, brass earring that contains a scrap of paper with her name. Her voice is described as a sweet, sticky music, and when she sings, the world seems to lean in to listen. Her home is filled with the casual music of daily living, a pot of collard greens simmering on the stove, the soft thwack of a knife on a wooden board, the creak of her rocking chair on the uneven floor. Morrison spends long, unhurried paragraphs describing the taste of Pilot's egg bread, the way the river mist rises in the early morning, the gleam of water on her granddaughter Hagar's skin. Every sensory detail is placed with the care of a painter, adding the final highlight to a still life. In this house, Milkman first tastes a sense of belonging that is as rich and dark as molasses. The middle of the novel sends Milkman on a quest to the south, and the terrain shifts dramatically. The city falls away, replaced by dense, green forests, crumbling tobacco barns, and dirt roads that turn to red mud after a rain. Morrison writes about the air of rural Virginia with a botanist's love and a poet's ear. It smells of pine sap and wild honeysuckle, of wood smoke and sun-warmed earth. The nights are so dark you cannot see your own hand, and the stars press down like a million tiny bright eyes. Milkman meets old men who sit on the porch of the general store, whittling sticks and telling stories that unspool over hours. Their speech is slow and melodic, the kind of talk that wraps itself around you like a quilt. Morrison lets these scenes breathe. The pacing is patient, as unhurried as the southern sun crossing the sky. She knows that the deepest transformations happen not in moments of crisis, but in the long, quiet stretches between. The novel is laced with the image of flight, but it is always a flight that returns to the ground. Morrison gives us the myth of the flying Africans, those who lifted up and left the fields of enslavement, and she treats it not as a supernatural escape, but as a deep cultural memory, a lullaby handed down through blood. Towards the book's end, Milkman stands on a mountaintop at dusk, the sky striped with bands of purple and gold. He listens to the ancient song that names his ancestors, and in that moment, he feels the earth beneath his feet in a way he never has before. It is a scene of profound stillness. The wind picks up, cooling his skin. The trees below sway like a living ocean. He does not shout or weep, he simply understands, and that understanding feels like a pair of strong arms lifting him, gently, just an inch off the ground. Song of Solomon closes not with a clear resolution, but with a breathtaking leap, a moment that Morrison describes with a kind of slow-motion grace. It is high in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the air is thin and crystalline. The words are careful, deliberate, as if placing one foot after another on a high, narrow ridge. There is no violence in the telling, only a sense of release, of gravity loosening its grip. The image that lingers is of a man in the air, suspended against the sky, and whether he rises or falls is left for the reader to decide. It is an ending that feels like the last note of a hummingbird's wing, a blur of motion that becomes a kind of stillness. Morrison then draws the curtain, and we are left standing in the quiet that follows, the mountain wind washing over us like sleep. In 1987, Morrison published the novel that would become the tender, fierce heart of her career, Beloved. The book is set in 1873, just outside Cincinnati, Ohio, in a gray house at 124 Bluestone Road. The house is introduced to us not by its architecture but by its mood. It is full of baby's venom, and yet that baby's presence is not a horror in Morrison's hands. It is more like a lingering, a stubborn love that refuses to be forgotten. The light around the house is often described as slanted and golden in the late afternoon, filtering through the sycamore leaves and falling on the worn porch in trembling patterns. The yard is dusty but alive with the quiet industry of the women who live there. A few chickens scratch in the shade. A kettle sings on the stove. Morrison threads the supernatural so seamlessly into the ordinary that the ghostly child becomes simply another member of the household, one who breathes alongside the living in the quiet of the night. The novel opens onto a piece that is hard-won. Seethe, a woman with iron in her spine and a tree of scars on her back, has walked to freedom years before, crossing the Ohio River with a newborn in her arms and the taste of blood in her mouth. Now, she lives with her daughter Denver in the gray house, and the days have a rhythm. There is the stirring of the cornmeal, the slosh of water from the well, the careful mending of a torn apron. Morrison describes the kitchen in the first light, a blue wash over the table, the smell of wood smoke and strong coffee, the gentle hiss of the iron on cloth. Outside, the road is dusty and still. The river, which runs just out of sight, hums its low, eternal note. For long stretches, the novel simply lives inside the textures of this domestic life. It refuses to hurry. It gives the reader time to feel the grain of the floorboards, to hear the creak of a rocking chair that soothes even the ghosts. The arrival of a young woman named Beloved changes the atmosphere of the house. She appears, no one is quite sure how, one afternoon, sitting on a stump near the yard. She is dressed in a thin, damp dress, and her skin smells of river water and new leaves. Morrison never allows the reader to be frightened of her. Instead, she makes Beloved a creature of overwhelming need and love, someone who simply wants to be near Seethe, to lay her head in Seethe's lap, to listen to the stories they tell each other. The days that follow are bathed in a strange, honeyed light. Morrison describes the three women, Seethe, Denver, and Beloved, moving through the house like figures in a dream. They braid one another's hair by the fire. They share slices of bread spread with blackberry jam. The world outside fades to a soft blur, and the gray house becomes a warm, enclosed nest of memory and desire. Nature, as in all of Morrison's novels, acts as a steady, healing witness. The sycamore trees in the yard rustle their broad leaves. The creek at the edge of the property runs clear and cold. In passages of astonishing beauty, Morrison describes the slow turning of the seasons around the house. In spring, the dogwoods bloom in a white froth. In the summer, the grass turns brown and sleepy under the sun. In autumn, the hickory nuts drop with a soft thud. Denver ventures out into these woods at times, finding a kind of chapel in the green silence. She follows a deer trail to a small clearing where the light filters through the canopy and pillars. There, she can hear only the birds and the whisper of her own breath. Morrison's description of this woodland sanctuary is like a deep, cleansing exhalation. It is a reminder that the earth itself can hold the weight of what humans cannot. The community beyond the yard also pulses with life. The women of the town, suspicious at first, begin to gather in quiet, purposeful ways. In one unforgettable scene, a group of them walk down the road toward 124 in the early morning. The mist is still rising from the ground, and the light is the color of lemon rind. They're dressed in their head wraps and long skirts, and they come not with weapons but with song. Morrison describes the sound they make as something older than words, a low, humming vibration that seems to rise up from the dirt itself. The power of the scene comes not from drama, but from the cumulative weight of quiet acts. A neighbor leaving a loaf of bread on the porch, a woman stopping to speak softly to Denver at the edge of the yard, the slow, gathering murmur of care. This is how Morrison shows healing not as a single bright moment, but as the slow return of the tide. Memory itself is the novel's central, gentle engine. Morrison does not present the horrors of Seed's past in sequence, but in fragments that surface like underwater springs. She gives us glimpses of Sweet Home, the plantation with its beautiful trees and its hidden cruelty. But even in those flashbacks, Morrison's eye falls on the quiet details, the way the sunlight played on the hanging moss, the taste of slaked lime on hot skin, the sound of a cow lowing in the distance. She writes about the scar on Seed's back as a chokecherry tree, a branching design that she never lets the reader see as a wound, but as a living, blooming thing. The story of Beloved is, ultimately, a story about the long, patient work of facing what hurts and letting it be transformed by love and community. Morrison's voice in these passages is as calm and steady as a hand on a fevered forehead. The novel ends with a quiet unspooling, a long, elegiac paragraph that repeats the word beloved like a chime. The ghost recedes, the women of the town return to their gardens and their kitchens, the seasons cycle once more. Morrison writes that this is not a story to pass on, and in that phrase resides a deep and layered wisdom. Some stories are not for casual telling, but they must be told anyway, in a whisper, in a room lit only by the coals of a dying fire. The final image of Beloved is not of a haunting, but of a riverbank after a flood, the water settling back into its channel, the mud dark and fertile, the first green shoots already pushing through. It is an image of profound peace, the natural world reclaiming its rhythm, and the reader is left floating there, on the edge of sleep, held by the low, steady sound of Morrison's voice. In the years following Beloved, Morrison's life became even more public, but she always returned to her quiet desk. The novel won the Pulitzer Prize, and the recognition brought interviews, travel, and a new visibility. Yet she continued to rise early, to make her tea, to look out over a garden or a city skyline and wait for the sentences to come. She understood that writing was not an act of force, but of receptivity, like listening for a bird call in the woods at dawn. She had become, by then, the keeper of a great river of stories, and she let that river flow through her with the same patient trust that a woman feels when she rocks a child in the middle of the night. Her study was a sanctuary of soft lamplight and stacked books, a place where the air smelled of paper and ink and the faint, sweet scent of violets. On an October morning in 1993, the telephone rang in Toni Morrison's home in Princeton, New Jersey. The voice on the other end told her that she had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. She was the first Black woman ever to receive the honor. The news rippled across the world, but Morrison received it with the same slow, thoughtful pause she brought to everything. Outside her window, the garden was turning toward autumn. The oaks were brushing the sky with amber and russet. Princeton was a town of old brick, climbing ivy, and the quiet precincts of the university where she had been teaching for years. The light that morning was pale and silver, the kind of light that makes even ordinary objects, a coffee cup, a pair of reading glasses, a stack of student papers, glow with a soft, unassuming beauty. In interviews that followed, she did not speak of triumph. She spoke of language, of the ancient, communal work of storytelling, of the ancestors who had carried the songs. She traveled to Stockholm in December to deliver her Nobel lecture, a speech that would become a meditation on the power of narrative itself. The setting was a concert hall bathed in golden candlelight, the walls of pale stucco and carved wood. She stood at the podium, a gray-haired woman in a dark dress, and began to speak in a voice that was unhurried and musical. She told the audience a parable about an old, blind woman and a group of young people who ask her, "Is the bird I am holding living or dead?" In Morrison's hands, the story became a reflection on the way language can wound or heal, on the responsibility each of us bears to treat words with care. The room was utterly still. You could hear the faint rustle of silk, the faraway click of a chandelier. Outside, the Swedish winter sky was a pale, glowing blue, and the streets were layered in quiet snow. The whole scene had the hush of a great cathedral. Her life in Princeton had a gentle, settled rhythm. She lived in a brick colonial-style house with dark shutters and a garden that ran down to a small stone patio. In the summer, the flower beds were thick with lavender, coneflowers, and rosemary. She would often sit outside on a wooden bench in the late afternoon, a shawl around her shoulders, watching the bees move among the blossoms. Inside, her study was a nest of warm lamplight and mahogany shelves. A large window overlooked the garden, and on the sill, a small collection of smooth stones and sea glass caught the morning sun. Her typewriter, she always preferred the steady clack of keys to the hum of a computer, sat on an old, scarred desk that had traveled with her from New York. The walls were lined with photographs of her sons, of friends, of James Baldwin and Chinua Achebe and other kindred souls. It was a room that smelled of old paper and very faintly of sandalwood, a room made for the slow, patient work of making sentences. Morrison continued to write, and each new novel was an arrival, not an announcement. There was Jazz, a book that moved like its namesake music, set in Harlem in the 1920s, where women laughed on fire escapes and the windows were always open to catch the breeze from the Hudson. There was Paradise, set in an all-black town in Oklahoma, a novel of dust roads and convent gardens and the long, measured light of the Great Plains. In all of them, the same unchanging grace, the weather, the light, the texture of a kitchen table, the sound of a woman humming while she ironed. Even when the subject was loss, the prose remained tender, lulling, a hand on your shoulder instead of a fist. Morrison understood that a writer could offer the same comfort as the low murmur of a radio left on through the night, a steady, human presence against the silence. As the years passed, her hair became entirely white, a soft cloud around her face, and she moved through the world with the unassuming dignity of a grandmother who held deep secrets. She would be seen walking the tree-lined paths of the Princeton campus, often pausing to touch the bark of an old elm or to watch a flock of sparrows scatter into the sky. Students who passed her felt a quiet thrill, but she never made herself remote. She gave readings in small auditoriums, her voice carrying the same cadence she had learned as a girl in Lorain. After the applause, she would sit and sign books for hours, looking into the faces of young people and listening to their own stories. She knew that her words had become a kind of home for many, a place where they could see themselves reflected not as figures in a history book, but as living, breathing witnesses of joy and sorrow. That knowledge did not puff her up. It made her still more gentle. In her final years, she continued to work on small essays, introductions, and children's books, always in that same pool of lamplight. She took joy in her grandchildren, in the way they would run through the garden and ask her to tell them stories about the old days. She would sit them down on the stone patio and describe a place called Lorain, where the lake wind smelled of iron and the marigolds sometimes did not grow. She would tell them about Pilot's hut by the river and about the girls in the bottom lying in the tall grass. Her voice, when she told these stories, was the same voice she had put on paper, slow, warm, full of pauses that let the images settle. She understood that the deepest legacy an artist can leave is not a list of awards, but the quiet assurance that someone, somewhere, is reading a sentence she wrote and feeling less alone in the dark. Toni Morrison died on an August night in 2019 in a New York hospital at the age of 88. The summer air that night was thick and warm, and the city outside her window hummed with its endless, gentle motion. Around the world, readers lit candles and left copies of Beloved and Song of Solomon on their nightstands. The obituaries were long and full of praise, but the truest memorial is something softer. It is the light still falling on the gray house at 124 Bluestone Road in the minds of those who read. It is the rustle of sycamore leaves. It is the sound of a woman's voice in a quiet room, reading a passage aloud to a friend. Morrison once said, "We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language. That may be the measure of our lives." She made language into a cradle, a harbor, a field of marigolds that bloom even when all the seeds have failed. Now, when the world gets too loud, we can close our eyes and walk into one of her sentences, and there, in that soft, steady light, we can rest.